And come on, survey says boom. And page loads. There we go. All right. So that's working. I can park that in the other scene. Minimize that. And we should be good to go. We'll just give it another minute to make sure that everyone else is able to log in, since the YouTube only just went live. Hope everybody is doing well. If you want to get your pages turned, you can see that we're going to be beginning in Leviticus, Vayikra 9, number 24, and then beginning chapter 10.
Okay, this is
all right. Looks like we are good to go. I think our usual people are on. Anyone else? Well, they're a little late and they can catch up. So, as I said, good afternoon to everyone. Nice to have you all here. Certainly missed our chance to study last week during the Pesach holiday, but we are back at it, picking up narratively where we left off, which is to say in Parashat Shemini. Now, if you remember back in both Vayikra and Tzav, we had been given numerous rules regarding the use of the sacrifices and how they should be carried out. But we had also been given more details of the appointment of Aaron and his sons to the Kohanic, the priestly status, that they would have special roles to play in handling the sacrificial service of the temple, Mishkan at this time, the tabernacle. And we are now in Shemini seeing those instructions being carried out, seeing the inauguration, if you will, of the Mishkan itself, the tabernacle, as well as the inauguration of Aaron and his sons. And in chapter 9, which I'm afraid because of time constraints, we can't read through the entire thing, there were many of the inaugural sacrifices taking place. We will refer back to that, so just understand that they were taking place. And then at the very end, we can see a statement of acceptance, if you will. That's going to begin our story. So we're picking up with chapter 9, verse 24. Fire came forth from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar. And all the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces. All right, so the sacrifices have been done, the pieces have been laid on the altar, and God provides the fire. God ignites it in a sign of agreement that this has been carried out correctly, that this has been done properly, that those sacrifices have been welcomed, and that this is meeting with divine approval. Hold on a second, someone else to admit. Then with regards to what the people's response was, they saw this happen. So this was a public event. They shouted, and the word used here for shout is a generally joyful type of shout, not shout of ah, but shout of aha, more of an excited exclamation. And falling upon their face is not a negative thing. It is a historical reaction that people seem to have used at this time period when experiencing a especially moving divine moment. So this shows that God accepted the sacrifices that Aaron and his sons had made, and that the people recognized that God accepted the sacrifices, and the people are accepting that God accepting. There is a general agreement. This is a beautiful high point of agreement and cooperation between God, us, and the Kohanim. Right. And then it all gets ruined in chapter 10. Now, we've talked about the beginning of chapter 10 in much more detail. So we're going to read through the story because it's necessary to understand what comes next. But today we're going to focus more on the aftermath of the problem that's about to occur rather than the problem itself. Again, you can go back and look at my previous lessons on Parashat Shemini to see more of the interpretations of why Nadav and Avihu are going to be in trouble here. But we're going to sort of not exactly skim, but we're not going to spend too much time on this portion. We want to deal with the repercussions more than the event itself. The event gets a lot of attention, but the repercussions are also very important and good for us to know.
Right.
So chapter 10. Now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered before the Lord alien fire. Alien fire is my favorite idea for a science fiction novel, but alien here has nothing to do with something that is outer space. Alien here simply means that it is foreign, that it was, which he had not enjoyed upon them, that this was not fire that God had commanded to be presented. Just reminder, they had these metal pans. Let me get my hand in frame. They had these metal pans that they would have coals on, and then they would put the incense would hit the hot coals, and that would turn into smoke. So they are now putting some incense on this in a manner, in a way, in a time, or of a form that was not what God commanded. And indeed, all of that is argued about by the many commentators. But the important part is that they are breaking the protocol of how the Mishkan is meant to be used. Verse 2, and fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of the Lord. So we saw at the very end of chapter 9, fire coming out from God and consuming what was on the altar, and that was a sign of approval. Now we see fire coming out from God and consuming the presenters, these two men. And this is a sign of disapproval by most commentaries. There are a few ways that try to take this as being God was so pleased that he simply brought them to him, but the vast majority of commentary do not go that route and instead say that indeed these two had messed up. Exactly how they messed up, see my previous classes, but this was not a reward. This was a punishment for what they had done. And reminder that the rabbis believed that the punishment was always greater given the proximity to God and this degree of holiness. So we shouldn't be surprised that their errors here led to such a shocking outcome. This would not have been the case if they had simply made a mistake in their private life within the other commandments. But here in this place at that time, this was the unfortunate consequence. Verse 3, then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord meant when he said, though through those near to me I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people. And Aaron was silent. Moses is reminding Aaron that, yeah, being a Kohen is not just about getting extra meat and special tithing. Being a Kohen also means a higher risk factor, because as you will be nearer to God in a physical sense, and you will be nearer to God in terms of administering to the sacrifices, you will be held to a higher standard in order that God's glory will always be properly established in the eyes and the feelings of the community. And Aaron was silent. A lot has been said about the silence of Aaron. Some see it simply as a sign of stunned mourning. Others see this as a sign of acceptance, that he is admitting that what Moses has said is right, that what his sons had done was wrong, and that there was no point in arguing or complaining about this moment that just happened. Everyone with me so far? All right. Verse 4. Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, son of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said to them, come forward and carry your kinsmen away from the front of the sanctuary to a place outside the camp. So he calls for these cousins of the deceased to come and to take the bodies away, they came forward and carried them out of the camp by their tunics, as Moses had ordered. The idea here being that they are carrying them in a way that minimizes their contact with them. And verse 6 is where it starts getting very difficult. And Moses said to Aaron and his sons, Eleazar and Itamar, do not bare your heads, do not rend your clothes, lest you die and anger strike the whole community. But your kinsmen, all the house of Israel, shall bewail the burning that the Lord has wrought. So Moses is giving advice here that they are not allowed to engage in public signs of mourning. The baring of a head and the tearing of clothes is a sign of grief in Jewish law. And therefore, they are being told, do not take on these public signs of mourning. This doesn't mean that they are not able to be sad internally. This does not mean they are not able to grieve, but it means that in these public ways, they shouldn't, because perhaps that will lead them to other problems, other mistakes. Perhaps that will lead them to be so upset with what God has done that they will commit other errors. And then not only will they die, but there may be a more widespread damage to all of the community. However, Moses doesn't say that no one should mourn these two people publicly, Nadav and Avihu, the two sons, but instead, the rest of the house of Israel, who are not involved in the practices of the Mishkan, who are not on the front line, if you will, they will mourn. So this is not saying that there is no room for grief for these. This is not saying they got what they deserved, so let them rot. This is simply saying that you are too close to being in a position of danger to allow yourself to slip through the process of mourning into a potentially more dangerous state. Therefore, we will mourn on your behalf. And as it goes on to say, in terms of his instructions in verse 7, and so do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die, for the Lord's anointing oil is upon you. And they did as Moses had bidden. So you are in the middle of this. You cannot step away from this. No one else can do this but you. You have to finish what was begun in chapter 9. We'll take care of the grieving in a public manner on your behalf. And it seems that Aaron and his sons, Eleazar and Itamar, went along with the plan from that point. All right. So before we get to the beginning of the description of the aftermath, any questions or comments thus far?
In the last two verses, we've had the phrase, lest you die, or so that you should not die. And that seems to be setting up something here.
Absolutely. It is establishing that the Mishkan is a dangerous place for people to be, that the proximity to God is not an easy place for people to be, and that when you come to the doorway between life and death that the Mishkan represented, that the potential for your own death goes up greatly. And so they are being given extra incentive, encouragement, warning to obey the commands that Moses is giving on behalf of God in order that they too not suffer likewise. God was always considered to be a very scary force in the ancient world. In many ways, people have overtamed the concept of God and created more of the idea of God as being your big buddy in the sky. But the idea that when drawing close to God, one becomes more accountable and more liable for their behavior and more walking a fine line that could lead to more drastic consequences was a very common belief in the biblical and rabbinic periods. And only recently have people begun to treat God too casually. And this is trying to set the tone from the beginning that God is not to be treated casually, especially in the holiest of holy places. Any other questions or comments before we move to verse 8 and onward? All right. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, here we get a direct prophecy from God to Aaron. Drink no wine or other intoxicant, you or your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die. This is a law for all time throughout the ages. For you must distinguish between the sacred and the profane, and between the unclean and clean. And you must teach the Israelites all the laws which the Lord has imparted to them through Moses. So this section has been interpreted by many as being a chastisement of the two deceased, that perhaps they had been drinking, perhaps they were a little drunk, which is why they did what they did. And that explains their reckless behavior and the consequence. It could also simply be saying that drinking is one way that people will make mistakes of differentiating between what is and isn't sacred or profane. By the way, this is one of the places where we see the language of Havdalah, which we used to mark the difference between the holy time of Shabbat and the mundane time of the rest of the week. And that although drunkenness is one way that could happen, it could happen for other lapses as well. There are other ways for people to make errors of judgment. And yet these Kohanim are going to be responsible for bringing what is and isn't appropriate into the holiest of places. And they are responsible both through their more overt lessons, but also through their lesson of example for teaching the Israelites how the laws are meant to be embraced by the nation. So we see a very strong possible argument for what has happened as being a failure of judgment among Nadav and Avihu, whether brought on by liquor or not, but that a failure of judgment when you are a leader and when you are stepping into the holy of holy precincts, the consequences are much more severe. All right, so with that in mind, many people usually stop reading there, but like I said, this year I want to make sure that we get to the rest of the chapter and see a little bit more of how the repercussions and aftermath. So beginning from verse 12, Moses spoke to Aaron and his remaining sons, Eleazar and Itamar. Take the meal offering that is left over from the Lord's offerings by fire and eat it unleavened beside the altar, for it is most holy. You shall eat it in the sacred precinct, inasmuch as it is your due and that of your children, from the Lord's offering by fire, for so I have been commanded. But the breast of elevation offering and the thigh of gift offering, you and your sons and daughters with you may eat in any clean place, for they have been assigned as a due to you and your children from the Israelites' sacrifice of well-being. Together with the fat of the fire offering, they must present the thigh of gift offering and the breast of elevation offering, which are to be elevated as an elevation offering before the Lord, and which are to be your due and that of your children with you for all time, as the Lord has commanded. So scroll back up to the top of 12. So Moses begins in the continuation of that day's events to give instructions regarding what needs to be eaten from the mincha offering and the other offerings that were presented during the day's activities, and what can and can't be left over, and where it can and can't be eaten, and who may or may not eat it. This continuation is trying to reinforce that not only the initial part of the sacrifices need to be done correctly, but also what is done with them once the sacrifice has been completed needs to be done correctly. And as there might be some suspicion that the sacrifices were interrupted, which we'll talk about in more detail in our commentary section, Moses seems to be wanting to clarify the general rules of how the sacrifices are handled after the initial offering actions have taken place. Everyone got that a basic idea? Okay, so we then move down to verses 16, which is going to be a block till the conclusion. Then Moses inquired about the goat of sin offering, and it had already been burned. Exclamation point in the English, but not in the Hebrew. But it does seem, vehine soraf, and behold, it was burnt, seems to be a bit of surprise. He was angry with Eleazar and Itamar, Aaron's remaining sons, and said, "Why did you not eat the sin offering in the sacred area? For it is most holy, and he has given it to you to remove the guilt of the community and to make expiation for them before the Lord. Since its blood was not brought inside the sanctuary, you should certainly have eaten it in the sanctuary as I commanded." So Moses is perplexed. It seems that Eleazar and Itamar have failed to carry out the proper eating of the remainder of the sin offering that had been given, the chatat, and that is a problem based off the restatement of the rules that he had just given a little bit before, and thus he is angered. Now, is he angry because they're not listening to him, or is he angry because if they are doing something else wrong with the sacrifices, that this may lead to their death as well? Or is he angry at them because by doing something else wrong with the sacrifices, they are again failing to set the proper example for the rest of the Israelites on this very first day of the official sacrifices being offered? Or could it be a combination of all of them? Well, we are going to see Aaron respond on behalf of his two sons, on behalf of Eleazar and Itamar. Let me just roll down here. Verse 19. And Aaron spoke to Moses, "See, this day they brought their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, and such things have befallen me. Had I eaten the sin offering today, would the Lord have approved?" And when Moses heard this, he approved. All right, so this verse 19 is a little bit confusing. It's confusing for a number of grammatical reasons, which I don't want to go into too much detail, but the main issue seems to be where our translation reads this as, and had I eaten the sin offering today, that there are those who read that as being a question, as our translation reads it, and there are those who read it as being a statement, meaning I did eat the sin offering of today. So it's unclear exactly what Aaron's rebuttal to Moses is. It's unclear exactly how the things having befallen him today have any bearing upon what is being eaten or not eaten, and where it's being eaten, and who's eating it. And it's unclear whether or not his response is indeed a legitimate response to Moses's concern, or if it's dealing with a different issue, or if it's something else. However, verse 20 tells us that Moses is okay with this, that it is good in his eyes, paralleling the language that was what Aaron was saying about what would be good in the eyes of God. So this last section here of an argument between Moses and Aaron's family over what should and shouldn't be done with the extra part of the chatat offering is a very confusing conclusion to the beginning of the chapter, which started in such tragedy. So obviously, if anything is confusing to us, that doesn't mean that it is confusing in and of itself. It just means we need to study it in more detail. And so we are going to do so now. All right, let me just rearrange my various windows. I think I can squeeze one more zoom level out for the benefit of those who are watching this on a small screen. All right, so Tur HaAruch tries to give us a summary of the problems that might be taking place here according to the different commentaries. So the Talmud and Rashi both read this as a question. That is to say, Moses is expressing amazement to his brother Aaron that his sons, while in a state of aninut, had seen fit to perform their priestly duties in the tabernacle. So let me just point you back to what he's trying to draw your attention to. He is trying to say that they should have not been doing the activities that the Eleazar and Itamar should not have been engaging in this activity because they were in a state of aninut. Now, aninut is the term that is used for a person between the death of their loved one and their burial. It is a particularly heightened sense of shock. And during that time, we are free from most of the positive commandments. And we'll come back to what that term can mean in general. But it seems, says the Talmud and Rashi, that Moses is upset not because they failed to do something, but because they had actually done more than they should have, while they should have been in a state of mourning where they should have been prohibited from doing what they were doing. I know, confusing. Ramban, Nachmanides, claims that no aninut was involved, as all the duties that Eleazar and Itamar had performed had been completed before they became bereaved of their elder brothers. Remember, as I mentioned at the outset, and in chapter 9, much of the services had already been complete before we got to the offering of the fire by Nadav and Avihu, which brought their death. Now, as I said, aninut only begins when the relative dies. So if they are having done something that was before that, then if Moses realized they did it, but thought they had done it after, then that could be a source of confusion. If they had done it before, fine. If they did it after, then there's a problem. And if Moses was unsure, he might have been jumping to the wrong conclusion. As I pointed out, only then did heavenly fire descend and kill the two older sons of Aaron. Now, possibly Moses had not seen what the sons of Aaron had done, and he assumed that they might have found some blood from the he-goat, which had not yet been sprinkled, and they had proceeded to sprinkle that blood. So the idea of Ramban is that there was no aninut, but Moses was confused, and that's why he did what he did, or argued as he argued, rather. The verse 9:22, which we didn't read together, but you'll see, describing Aaron descending and subsequently blessing the people, referred only to his having completed the specific offerings of that particular day, of the inaugural offerings. It did not say that Aaron had already offered the male goat as a sin offering on account of the day of being the new moon. This offering, being a Musaf offering, was not yet due to have been offered, and was therefore not included in the report of Aaron having concluded his duties. In other words, the reason it had not been mentioned at all was that it had not been offered as yet. So the Tur, based off his father, the Rosh's interpretation, says that Ramban is not actually, doesn't actually have the sequence correct, that indeed Moses had the right to believe that they had offered the chatat afterwards, after the death, because the part in chapter 9 was only talking about the specific inaugural sacrifices, which have their own unique status, whereas the chatat was an offering done on behalf of Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and that, being a Musaf offering, which is why we mentioned it during our Musaf service on the days of Rosh Chodesh, that would have been offered at a different time than the initial inaugurary, in the initial sacrifices that were commemorating the inauguration of the Mishkan and Aaron. So indeed, there may have been a sacrifice that was being carried out, or at least completed, after they had become onanim, after they had become mourners in that unique in-between moment of the death prior to burial. And thus, there may be a good reason why Moses is upset that they have done something inappropriate, not because of the specific mechanics, but because of the timing, that apparently an onan, somebody who is in mourning, should not be involved in this activity. Okay, if you're not completely confused, you're not paying attention, because it is a very confusing topic. So let's see if we can find a couple other explanations that maybe can straighten this out a little bit. So we continue with Ibn Ezra. When these befell me, remember, this is Aaron's retort of, this is what's happened to me on this day. What does this mean? The implied subject is the concern or the anguish over the death of his sons. Because of this, I was unable to eat all of the sin offering. I only ate that which was pleasing, hayitav, to God, meaning the minimum that would relieve me of my obligation. If the former commentators are correct, then we must translate if I were to eat using the future tense as the subjunctive, as an if statement rather than as I did this. And we do find such words in the future tense, accented on the penultimate syllable, lest I be poor and steal, Proverbs 39. In such a case, Aaron's meaning would be, I was a mourner who had not yet buried his dead, an onem, and a mourner who has not yet buried his dead may not eat from the sin offering. So Ibn Ezra is trying to help us read both versions of this argument. On the one hand, Aaron could be defending what he did because he did actually eat, but he is defending that he only ate a very little. And he only ate a very little because of everything that had happened that day, meaning the death of his sons. He ate the minimum measure in order to discharge his duty, but did not eat more. The rest was burnt. And that is what Moses was upset about. Why did you burn the rest instead of eating it? And he is saying, I couldn't eat the rest of it. I was in mourning. On the other hand, he does agree that it is possible to interpret as being, I didn't eat anything because if I were to eat it, God would have been angry, doing it in the different grammatical sense. And as we know, well, as he appears to know, a mourner who has not yet buried their dead should not eat from the sin offering. So it seems to be two different versions. Either Aaron did eat, but only a little, and the rest was burnt, and that's what Moses was angry about. Or Aaron didn't eat at all, and that's what Moses is angry about. But Aaron is pointing out that he wasn't allowed to eat, that it wasn't possible for him to eat because of being in the status of being an onen. So we still haven't resolved it, but hopefully at least you can understand the argument between the different opinions of how to read these verses. All right, so let's see if we can get at least one type of argument, in this case coming from Shemini. Seeing that I have been struck by such a tragic loss, right? What is the thing that's befallen me today? That two of my sons who were priests have died suddenly. They were supposed to help me eat the relevant parts of the sacrifice so that none would have become leftovers that had to be burned. Would it have been pleasing in the eyes of the Lord that these parts would have become leftovers and thus would have to be burned outside the holy precincts, seeing that only 3 of us are left? I have eaten the parts of the sin offering this day that I was halachically permitted to eat together with my 2 remaining sons. So Shemini is reading this as saying that Aaron did eat some, but he couldn't eat all. And why not? Because he is down 2 sons who would have been eating part of the extra meat. And therefore, it was gone. They went ahead and burnt it rather than allowing it to become a leftover that couldn't be eaten by anyone and that would have to be burnt outside the holy precincts. Aaron is, in a sense, reminding Moses that he cooked for all 5 of them, but now there are only 3 of them. And you can't expect 5 to eat the same amount as 3. And instead, he went ahead and ate that which he was halachically permitted to eat with the 2 remaining sons, and the remainder was burnt. Make sense? Hopefully, whether it makes sense or not, you're beginning to understand that there is a tension here between what Moses expects to be done in either direction and what Aaron was able to do in either direction, and that this is all being translated through the intersection of what is the halacha with regards to these sacrifices under circumstances like this. And these circumstances like this seem to change things. The death of these 2 sons seems to have thrown everything into confusion and grief. So can we just say this is easy to navigate? Or should we recognize in the confusion of this section and the confusing argument with more of a bitter tone between Aaron and Moses than we've seen before is being brought on by not only the massive importance of this inaugural event and the sacrifices that are being offered, but also by the massive tragedy of the loss of the 2 sons and the grief that Aaron is feeling personally. Does Aaron have to completely comport himself as though he was a selfless vehicle of the ritual sphere and merely going about things like a robot, or are things going to need to be adjusted because he is a human being that has just suffered great tragedy? Whether he is engaging in clothes rending or wailing, it does seem like there should be some repercussions to that loss on the rest of the service that is taking place. And that is how our commentators are wrestling over it. All right, so we've seen Chizkuni's version. Let's go ahead and see what Or HaChaim tries to argue for this. Perhaps Aaron felt slighted by Moses' angry reproof in verses 16 to 17 to his sons, why they had not eaten the meat of the sin offering. He's explaining why Aaron is responding in the way he does. Aaron felt that at a time when he was still in shock from the death of his two older sons, an Onan, and the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, had a relatively free hand that such an accusation would endanger the lives of his surviving sons. Aaron's outburst therefore may be interpreted as the complaint of a father whose feelings of mercy towards his children have been aroused. So Aaron is going, look, wait, back off. You're getting mad at my two surviving sons, while my two other sons haven't even been buried yet. And my two surviving sons are doing the best they can and are even more susceptible to making mistakes now because the evil inclination has a higher power over us when we are in this moment of shock and grief. It's more likely to make us come to an error and have even worse repercussions. So you're getting mad at my kids? Back off from my kids. And any parent who's ever had somebody try to discipline their children in front of them when it was an illegitimate moment knows this feeling of defensiveness, of coming back with a sharp defense of your children, that even if they did something wrong, you don't deserve to talk to them the way you currently are. And of course, Aaron is saying they didn't do anything wrong. You, Moses, are misunderstanding the situation and the peril that my children are in while they officiate at the temple, at the Mishkan. Questions or comments on Or HaChaim's insight here?
Yeah, Rabbi, this is his comment really goes closest to how I've been looking at this. We know Aaron is a peacemaker, and here he sees his children being verbally accosted. And so to make peace, he redirects Moses's anger by Eleazar and Itamar to himself. That's step one. And also says in Proverbs, one who reproves boldly makes peace. So he turns this back on Moses. In a way, he's been reproving Moses. Why are you attacking them? In effect, because it's really, he as the Kohanim, as the high priest, it's responsibility that the sacrifice is probably done. And so he brings Moses back to the issue, which is, well, was this performed adequately? To which then Moses has to agree, well, yeah, this was an adequate performance of the sacrifice of the mitzvot, and that takes care of whatever anger was brewing in this intra-clan argument.
But it does raise another question, which is what Or HaChaim is going to continue on, and which is a very important topic, which is, was it Aaron's place to make the decision about whether or not to eat how much or what of the remaining sacrifice? Or was that a decision left to Moses and Aaron was overstepping his bounds? Yes, Aaron as the head Kohen has great authority, but he doesn't have the authority to institute new commandments. That is something that is still only allowed from Moses. So perhaps this is an overstatement of his position. And indeed, there is a general question in Judaism of when can a student give a ruling in the presence of the teacher? That when is that not considered to be too arrogant and too audacious? So let's read a little bit from Or HaChaim of how he interprets those types of circumstances. Perhaps we can prove from here, meaning this topic in Leviticus 10, under what circumstances a disciple is permitted to give a halakhic ruling in the presence of his teacher instead of referring the problem to the teacher first. It seems that Aaron had taken it upon himself to give a ruling and thereby offended the honor of Moses, his teacher. So rather than Moses just being angry about them breaking the rules, it could be that Moses is also angry that they have made their own rules when that is not their place. Perhaps we can answer this by saying that Aaron's decision was not really what we call a halachic ruling. Maybe it wasn't actually that. Aaron had simply used logic. We know from Deuteronomy 26:14 that the farmer had to declare that he had not eaten any of the second tithes or the like while in a state of aninut. Now, that's with regards to a farmer and with regards to second tithes. Seeing that the level of sanctity of such tithes was on a far lower level than that of the sin offering, the chatat, Aaron simply reasoned that he would most certainly be forbidden to partake of the meat of that offering as well. So Aaron is trying to get himself off the hook by emphasizing the aninut and therefore saying, of course, we couldn't eat it because as you yourself taught in Deuteronomy, which yes, I know is out of order in terms of how it's presented in the Torah, but there are many who believe that all of the rulings were given at Sinai prior to the inauguration of the Mishkan. So Aaron would have known that general rule from 26 in Deuteronomy, that he is just making a logical deduction. And he himself had been taught the law about tithes by Moses. All he had done, therefore, was to apply what Moses had taught him to a different situation. He had therefore thought that Moses himself had instructed him to burn the meat, seeing that there was no one authorized to eat it. So rather than Aaron claiming a new rule, Aaron was simply claiming a new application of an existing rule. And that is permitted. If I tell someone they can't eat bacon because it's pork, and then they say, oh, well, I guess that means I can't eat ham because it's also pork, they're not making a new ruling, and they're not going to offend their teacher for having made that rule. They're just making a logical inference from the original ruling that they had been taught. And thus, Aaron's response to Moses was to say, back off on my kids. We're not breaking or inventing new rules. We're just applying the rules you taught us. And maybe you didn't think about the implication, to which I'm sorry, but my kids are the ones who are dead. And therefore, I had to think about the implication that if a farmer couldn't eat the second tithes while in this onanut period, then neither could I or the brothers of the deceased. So what? I didn't invent anything. This is just the logical implication. And Rashbam offers his own take on this. The reference is to the burnt offering and sin offering of Aaron and his sons, about which the instructions had been issued in 9:2, way back at the beginning before we even started reading today. Aaron's sons had assisted him in the transfer of the blood from the place where the slaughtering took place to the altar. This too had been mentioned in 9:9. This is why Aaron remonstrated, argued with Moses, asking why he was angry at his sons, seeing that both he and his sons had offered the mandatory offerings of their consecration rites. Seeing that while engaged in such a holy pursuit, fate had dealt him such a blow, how could he be expected to eat, that is to say, enjoy other sacred meats of a permanent character, not part of his inaugural rites? His enjoyment of this day had already been spoiled. So a slight tweak, he is trying to tell Moses, look, we did all the stuff that we had to do. We did all of the mandatory offerings of the inauguration. That was all discussed back in chapter 9. The thing you're upset about, the chatat, is not part of the inauguration, but part of the daily or at least regular permanent sacrifices, which will be held by our people for hundreds and hundreds of years. Those I am not obligated to eat, right? Those have their own status. And therefore, due to the events of the day, there was no way that I or his brothers could, or their brothers could eat them. Therefore, back off, right? We did what we had to, but that doesn't mean we're going to do the optional things as well. And again, he is interpreting it as being inappropriate for someone who is an onen to eat of those secondary type things. The ones that were for the inauguration, yes, they ate what they needed to, as at least to discharge their duty. Anything else, they're not doing. And it's wrong to even think that they would. So he's clarifying with Moses that they did what they had to, but they're not doing any more. And then the question becomes, did Moses really understand and did he agree with what they finally decided? And Or HaHaim again gives us a nice summary of Moses's reaction. Another approach would focus on the first words in the verse, Moses heard, which, if you remember, may have sounded a little bit like an extraneous conclusion. It could have just said, and Moses approved, right? Why tell us that Moses heard? Because this may mean that Moses had heard from God about the difference between the degree of sanctity of one-time offerings, the inauguration, and those of regular offerings, the Rosh Chodesh offering. As a result, he approved of what Aaron had done. Now, so basically what he's saying here is that what Moses heard was a small off comment, meaning that God said, yeah, what he said is right. Is God is clarifying to Moses that indeed there is a difference in the level of sanctity between the inaugural sacrifice and the regular sacrifices, and that Moses now gets it because he got it from God. And you may counter that by saying that if Moses had heard the ruling from God, why had he been angry at Aaron? Which, after all, if he knew that this was correct, then why make a shouting match of this? Perhaps he was angry because he himself had not yet told Aaron about this, and he thought that Aaron had done what he did without adequate reason. So first option is, I know it's right, but I didn't tell you it was right, so how did you know it was right? Because I don't want you running around doing just what you think is right, even when it ends up being right, because you have no right to decide what is right. That's my job. Your job is to do the sacrifices. My job, says Moses, is to decide what's right. And I get my orders from God, you get your orders from me. So Moses may have been upset not with the result, but he may have been upset with the method that Aaron used to reach that result. Or it is also possible that Moses, who was able to receive prophetic revelations at any time, now received word from God as to the correct procedure. As a result, he was pleased to have God confirm that Aaron had acted correctly. Now, personally, I like this better for the timeline, that Moses was angry at Aaron for what he had done because he had not considered the implications. Aaron explained the implications, saying, we ate what we had to, but we didn't eat what was optional because of being in the state of mourning. And God confirmed to Moses that indeed the logical deduction that Aaron had made based off Moses's own teachings was actually correct. And Moses is now reassured that Aaron had not invented a new rule, but had merely applied the ruling in a way that was logical, consistent, and a proper implication to be followed. And thus, everybody is reconciled by the end of the chapter. What do we think? All right, well, let's just remind ourselves about how this continues to be an important concept even for today. Taken from the Mishnah Torah, Rambam's Law Code, it is a positive commandment to mourn for one's closest relatives. As it is said, Leviticus 10:19, had I eaten the sin offering today, would the Lord have approved? So Rambam is weighing in, saying that indeed they didn't eat from the chatat, they ate from the other, but not from it, and that he reasoned they didn't was because they were in mourning. And so this passage is being used as the requirement for mourning, rather than simply saying that mourning is optional, meaning that one ought to or could or is allowed to mourn for those that they have lost. Rambam is pointing to this and saying this is an obligation, that you don't get to choose to do something like chowing down on a lovely piece of meat that you shouldn't be eating just because you don't care about mourning. Whether you want to mourn or not, you have to mourn. And by mourn, it doesn't just mean feel sad, because even if you don't feel sad, there are still limits on what you can do. That the actions of mourning are also obligatory, and we may not be able to command feelings, but we can certainly command a restraint on behavior during that period of mourning. And mourning is not based on scripture except for the first day only, meaning that technically, as a Torah law, mourning is only required on the first day because it is the day of death and the day of the funeral. In the ancient world, death and funeral usually occurred on the same day. They didn't have as long of a pause between when a person died and when they were buried. But the rest of the 7 days, the Shiva period of mourning that we still observe, are not Torah mandated, even though it says in Genesis 50, and he mourned for his father 7 days, taken from the story of Jacob and Joseph. So yes, there is a hint that 7 days is standard, but as far as the obligation, the true core mitzvah, the first day is the only one in the Torah. However, when the Torah was given, the law was renewed, meaning that we do mourn, and Moses, our teacher, established the 7 days of mourning and the 7 days of celebrating for Israel, meaning that, yes, the Torah itself only claimed 1 day, but since the time of Moses, based upon the overall reading of the other stories of grief within that text, we have the practice of mourning for 7 days for those that are our close relatives that have died. But what I also really appreciated with Rambam bringing here is that we not only have 7 days of mourning, but we also have 7 days of rejoicing. Some of these you're probably familiar with, the 7 days of Pesach that we just had, the 7 days of Sukkot that we have, but it is also traditional to celebrate for a wedding for 7 days. I know most people would consider that to be overkill, and that doesn't mean that one has the whole wedding reception over again, over and over again for all 7 days, but it does mean that you would make an additional feast, an additional seudah, much more low-key perhaps than that first day, with inviting new people to all of those days of rejoicing so that you stretch out the celebration for 7 days, which personally I think is a wonderful idea, rather than having the newlyweds completely disappear off on a honeymoon and being sort of plucked out of the community, letting them and the community enjoy the celebration for a week, and then take your honeymoon and have that great time together. But what this is saying, and hopefully you've seen throughout all of the text, is that both joy and mourning can disrupt many of the other activities that we normally associate with a regular Jewish life. Sometimes it's confusing to navigate the ins and outs of how do we properly behave when something important coincides with something tragic, which may also coincide with something joyous. And indeed, this is why we sit, we study, we discuss, we try to find the right path so that at the moments of these complicated life situations, we can feel guidance, support, and the strength to know that how we are living and acting is following a pattern that will reinforce the wisdom that Judaism has and allow us to have higher highs, have greater joys, and to mitigate the pain of our sorrows. I'll open it up now for additional questions or comments.
All right. The other thing that Rabbi, that jumps out at me in this passage, it was verses 8 through 11. It's not often that we have the Lord speaking to Aaron independently by himself. It's unusual,
yes,
to put it mildly. But so Aaron's sons die. Aaron is silent. Then the Lord speaks to him, and then the next time Aaron speaks, interaction with Moses. So he's already had that. I don't know if that's if I look at that passage as the Lord comforting Aaron, because we're taught to comfort the mourners, and clearly Aaron hears from Adonai. It may be somewhat off topic or somewhat seemingly irrelevant, but there's something to be said about that.
Definitely. I think at the very least, you can say that it is reassuring Aaron that despite the events of the day, God is still with Aaron, that God has not cut him off just because of what happened with Nadav and Avihu. What else we can draw from that? Well, like I said, it is fertile ground for different commentaries of whether this is making commentary about the deaths or whether this is just a more general statement of duties. But at the very least, Aaron must have at least been pleased that God was still on speaking terms with him, that God had not said, "Bah, your kids are so terrible, I'm not going to talk to you anymore," but that God was still there in his life. And indeed, when a person suffers a tragedy, sometimes simply knowing that God is still with us, even if we're not sure exactly what the whole content is or what it means, just knowing that God is with us is a very big part of drawing our strength to be able to go through those tragedies. All right, thank you all very much. See some of you tonight for Mishnah class, others tomorrow for the Pathway to Judaism class, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.